Have you ever watched a Hollywood movie and just frozen? Like the blood in your veins stopped because the set behind the actors looked exactly like those old Tartarian domes? And what if the reason it got wiped out wasn't some war or an erosion, but something darker? Something that still plays hide and seek right in front of us. Actual demons.
Welcome back to Alias Gray. In the previous episode, we explored how the controllers of today took over the world and how they engineered the resets. We examined how they turned against the Church of Reason and Science, the Church of Isa. If you have not watched that episode yet, I recommend you begin there before continuing with this one. We spoke about Tartarian technology and about a group of individuals who seized control after turning against what we described as the real church. But now it is time to study them more closely. We mentioned them briefly before, yet we did not fully examine the force behind them. What kind of influence drives their actions? What kind of presence stands behind their decisions? This is why we are beginning a new series, Demonology. It will run alongside our Tartaria expedition because the two subjects are connected. You will find this episode listed under Demonology, Tartaria, and movie explanations.
The Church of Isa didn't just appear overnight. It rose out of silence. We trace it back to the 9th century. Charlemagne, crowned emperor by Pope Leo III in 800 AD, didn't only build an empire with swords, he built one with ideas. The real shift came earlier. Fragments of older wisdom traditions, Hermetic, Gnostic, survived in pockets across the Mediterranean and Near East. Some say Isa refers to Isa ibn Maryam, the Quranic name for Jesus. Others claim it's an acronym, a cipher, or a deliberate corruption meant to hide the original name of the teaching. What we do know, by the time of the Carolingian Renaissance, certain texts were being quietly collected, translated, rewritten, not destroyed, reframed. The Church of Reason and Science wasn't born in monasteries. It lived in libraries that no longer exist on maps. It lived in minds that spoke of unity between geometry, light, sound, and divine order. Tartarian architecture embodied that order. Then came the pivot. The controllers didn't burn those libraries. They inherited them. They turned the tools of harmony into tools of control. They inverted the Church of Isa, took its symbols, its language, its promise of direct knowledge, and replaced direct experience with hierarchy, dogma, mediated truth. That inversion is what we're unpacking in Demonology, because the force behind the controllers isn't new. It's ancient, it's patient, and it's still wearing the mask it stole. Now, let us begin.
If you open Google and type the word demons, you will immediately see a familiar image, a red creature with horns, sharp teeth, wings, and fire surrounding it. This image has become the global stereotype of what a demon is supposed to look like. This modern visual template did not appear randomly. It was shaped over centuries of religious art, medieval imagination, and cultural repetition. The question we must ask is whether this image represents an ancient truth or whether it reflects a later construction that became dominant through theology and storytelling.
In ancient Greece, the word that later became demon was daimon, and the meaning was very different from the modern horror figure. Philosophers, such as Plato, described daimons as intermediary beings that existed between the human and the divine realms. The daimon was not automatically evil, and it could function as a guiding intelligence or a spiritual mediator. Socrates spoke of his daimonion as an inner voice that warned him against wrong actions. and he did not describe it as a hostile or destructive force. The early philosophical understanding framed the daimon as part of a structured metaphysical system rather than as a monster. In Christianity, the term began to shift in meaning. In the New Testament, demons are described as unclean spirits that possess individuals and oppose the mission of Jesus. Over time, theological development equated pagan gods with demons in order to delegitimize older religious systems. The transformation of former deities into demonic entities was part of a broader religious conflict that redefined spiritual hierarchies. Medieval Christian art intensified this imagery by portraying demons as grotesque beings with horns and animal features, and these depictions solidified the red-horned figure that dominates the modern imagination.
In Islamic theology, the framework is different, but still structured. The Quranic narrative describes jinn as beings created from smokeless fire, and they possess free will, just as humans do. Not all jinn are evil. Some are described as believers, while others are rebellious. Iblis is presented as a being who refused a divine command, and his story establishes a moral dimension rather than a monstrous appearance. The Islamic model does not rely on the red-horned caricature. It presents an unseen world that exists parallel to the human one, without collapsing all unseen entities into pure malevolence.
When we shift to mainstream science, the framework changes completely. Contemporary neuroscience and psychology do not recognize demons as independent supernatural beings. Experiences, historically interpreted as possession, are categorized under psychiatric or neurological conditions. Disorders such as schizophrenia involve auditory hallucinations and perceived external voices, and these symptoms can be misinterpreted within religious frameworks. As demonic influence, sleep paralysis, produces a sensation of pressure on the chest and the feeling of a presence in the room, and this phenomenon has been recorded across cultures with different symbolic interpretations. Neurological research has shown that stimulation of certain regions of the temporal lobe can generate a powerful sense of an unseen presence. Experimental settings have demonstrated that altering brain activity can induce mystical or entity-like experiences. From the scientific perspective, the brain is capable of producing highly convincing perceptions without an external agent. The mainstream position states that subjective certainty does not equal objective existence, and it prioritizes measurable evidence over testimony.
Anthropology adds another layer to the discussion. Every culture in recorded history has described non-visible beings that interact with humans. The forms differ according to geography and belief systems, yet the structural pattern appears consistently. Western societies describe demons with horns and fire. Middle Eastern traditions describe jinn with fluid forms, and East Asian traditions describe spirits and yokai with regionally specific features.
However, the persistence of the concept across civilizations raises an important question. If demons are purely neurological artifacts, why do structured narratives about them appear in unrelated societies separated by time and geography? If they are purely theological constructs, why do neurological experiments replicate sensations that resemble entity encounters? To answer this, we won't use books or science papers. No, we're cracking it with the one language they forgot to hide: symbolism. Because symbols aren't decoration, they are fingerprints. Carl Jung once said, "Man's need for mythology is like his need for physiology. Both are rooted in the same place." And movies, they're the new myth. So if the old gods left their signature on temples, the new ones left theirs on celluloid. Every dome, every red light, every backwards whisper, it's not coincidence, it's a code, a memory, like a dream your grandfather had, your mother half remembered, and now you're watching it flicker on a screen at 2 a.m. Not history, nor fiction, just memory, rising and speaking again. And we just started reading it.
Invasion of the Body Snatchers, released in 1978, directed by Philip Kaufman, is a remake of the 1956 film of the same name based on Jack Finney's novel, The Body Snatchers. While the original version from 1956 unfolds largely as a cautionary tale framed through Dr. Miles Bennell, recounting events after an invasion, the 1978 film removes that safety net and presents the takeover as gradual, inevitable, and ultimately successful. The 1956 film starred Kevin McCarthy as Dr. Miles Bennell. In the 1978 version, McCarthy appears in a cameo as a frantic man running through the streets warning others about the invasion, echoing his role in the original. Additionally, Don Siegel, director of the 1956 film, appears in the remake as a taxi driver, reinforcing the direct continuity between both films. The 1978 version opens in space, showing alien spores drifting toward Earth. These spores originate from a dying planet and represent a parasitic species that travels from world to world. Once they reach Earth, they attach themselves to plant life and grow into pod-like organisms. These pods duplicate human beings while they sleep. The original body disintegrates, leaving behind an emotionless copy that retains memories but lacks individuality and emotional depth.
The movie opens with Elizabeth Driscoll, played by Brooke Adams, walking through San Francisco. She spots an unfamiliar plant blooming with strange pink flowers. As she passes a group of children, led by their teacher, who stares oddly at her, she notices a priest swinging on a playground with kids, observing everything intently. This isn't accidental. The director deliberately shows a figure of authority infected early in the invasion. The priest, Robert Duvall cameo, on the swing, symbolizes corrupted religious authority, staring vacantly, implying early infection by pods, showing no institution is immune to invasion, eroding trust and moral guides. This ties to themes of paranoia and identity loss, evoking demonic takeover of societal pillars. And from the scene of the children, led by their teacher, it gives us a prediction for the endgame in this invasion. Like we spoke before, the takeover of Tartaria, completed in the last 100 years, but started 150 or more years prior. It needed time to fully unfold. So it's the same as symbolism here.
As Elizabeth Driscoll returns home to San Francisco, the camera stays low, very low near the ground, tilts slowly upward toward the streets, the buildings, her figure. There is something unsettling in that angle, a subtle distortion, a quiet warning, as if the city itself is watching. Inside, Jeffrey sits on the couch watching a sports game on television. Their closeness feels real, playful, familiar. There is warmth between them. There is trust, a bond, carefully established before the horror begins. Later, the couple carries on with everyday life. Elizabeth tidying the house, Jeffrey showering. In a medium shot, two statues stand in the background, a nude male and a nude female. The camera moves closer, very slowly. They are not decoration, they are a warning. Their human forms will soon be duplicated, lifeless, emotionless. The image lingers, a quiet symbol of individuality about to disappear.
In the next scene, Matthew Bennell inspects a French restaurant and finds rat droppings in the food. The staff glare at him with open hostility. Watchful eyes follow from the background, signaling the place as an alien-controlled hub. Outside, employees smash his car's windshield with a wine bottle, a clear warning to scare him off from their headquarters. Matthew's flooring it through the dark streets, knuckles white on the wheel. Suddenly, a lone police motorcycle rips by, sirens shrieking like a warning from hell. Something evil is loose in the city, and nobody's talking about it. Cut to the massive dome towering over his apartment building, ancient and ominous like some lost Tartarian relic, its giant clock ticking down second by second, counting toward doom. Inside, he's whispering fiercely with Elizabeth Driscoll, his one real ally. Then he's alone, hunched like a madman over piles of newspapers, scissors flashing as he carves out the truth the world won't admit. From the San Francisco Dispatch, webs shroud the Bay Area. Underneath, the subheads scream, "Spider colonies, and spiders fall from sky." It's pure nightmare fuel, that spider imagery, loaded with the same dark symbolism you see in films like Enemy. We'll unpack what it's really signaling later. All the while, the invaders move in silence, duplicating people perfectly, stealing faces, memories, souls, the doppelganger horror that erases you while the world smiles and says nothing changed.
After the call ends, Elizabeth slips into bed beside her boyfriend Jeffrey. Simple, weary sleep, the kind that comes after a long, draining day. Everything ordinary. But on the nightstand, the flower she carried in from outside rests in a glass of water. Moonlight catches its petals.
Elizabeth wakes up and finds Jeffrey behaving strangely. He is cold, emotionally flat, and distant. The broken glass he is cleaning is from the vase that contained the strange flower she had brought home. That flower was already part of the alien organism. During the night, a pod duplicate of Jeffrey was created while he slept. The original Jeffrey's body disintegrated into a dry, gray husk. The duplicate retains his memories and appearance, but not his emotional depth or individuality. When Elizabeth secretly follows him outside, she sees him disposing of the dried remains of his original body into the garbage truck. As the truck drives away, he watches it for a long moment. It is more like observation, the final removal of the human version of himself. So the old version did not simply disappear, it was replaced. While she is still watching him, the clock begins to ring. The sound is sudden, ominous. She feels like a signal, as if something has already started, especially when you see those two small toy figures, a male and a female, sitting near the clock. The time suddenly feels loaded, as if the clock is marking the start of a new reset. Outside, a gray-haired man with a beard runs down the street. Others move quickly too. There is urgency in their steps, yet the city remains strangely quiet. And in the background, someone is singing Amazing Grace, a hymn that returns at key unsettling moments throughout the film. Elizabeth reaches her office building. A man stands at the entrance, still. His eyes are fixed on her, unblinking. She walks past him. He follows her inside. Upstairs, she finds Matthew at her desk. She apologizes for being late. Their voices sound normal. Everything looks normal. But from different corners of the office, eyes are watching. Near the frosted glass door marked Field Investigators, a figure stands behind the glass, staring at them, an eerie gaze that does not move. But before we move on, look closely at this. Carved into the stone, 1932. Why that year? It was the deepest point of the Great Depression. Banks failing, systems cracking, millions pushed to the edge, and at the same time, Germany shifted. The Nazi Party rose into power. Symbols and myths started blending into politics quietly and fast. That year also marked the beginning of mass starvation in Ukraine, the Holodomor. Millions died. So 1932 isn't just a date. It sits at a crossroads of collapse, power, and control. Now the number itself, 1932. That adds to 15, and 15 becomes 6. In esoteric symbolism, 6 is linked to structure, to systems, to material control. So when this film shows 1932 carved in stone, it can be read as background detail, or it can be read as a signal. A reminder of what a reset year looks like when it starts quietly.